Hereby, I open this academic ceremony in which Francesca Rubiconto will defend her academic thesis, Technical Change, Competitiveness and Employment, a Sustainable Perspective. May I invite you to tell us more about your dissertation and the results of your research. The reason I was hesitating is that my eyes have just been kind of dealt with, so I can't see properly. Dear candidate, the floor is yours.
Dear Prorector, dear members of the Corona, dear colleagues, friends and family, thank you for joining this online session. Please allow me to share my presentation with you. In the coming 15 minutes, I will introduce briefly the topic of my dissertation, Technical Change, Competitiveness and Employment, a Sustainable Perspective. The starting point of the dissertation is the dual environmental and economic challenge of the Southern European economies. The IPCC suggests that the effects of climate change may be particularly severe in these economies due to prolonged drought and high temperature spikes, which could compromise key sectors of the economies like agriculture, food, tourism, and infrastructures. The destruction of economic activities is particularly worrisome for these economies, which have been plagued for decades with slowdown in growth, slackening aggregate demand and productivity, weakening international competitiveness, and as a result, rising involuntary unemployment. In this context, environmental innovation is proposed as a potential solution to this dual environmental and economic challenge. On the one hand, it could contribute to reducing emission. On the other, it could foster demand, growth, and employment. The literature suggests that this type of innovation has distinctive and superior effect in terms of economic and environmental performance compared to general innovation. However, most studies investigate the determinants of innovation and the role of environmental regulation in stimulating international competitiveness. The literature on the economic effects of environmental innovation is still scarce and mainly focused at the firm level. Therefore, Chapter 2 builds on the general literature on innovation at the macro and meso level, which identify positive effects for firms and sectors oriented toward technological competitiveness and product innovation. What is the main limitation here? These studies overlook distributive and displacement effect within industry, so between more and less polluting firms, but also across industries. The studies at the macroeconomic level are more comprehensive because they include both direct and indirect effects of innovation. However, they mostly rely on restrictive assumptions like perfectly flexible wages or market clearing by prices. Also, they focus primarily on productivity improvement, therefore disregarding product innovation. Chapter 2, in fact, identifies a main gap in the literature, the lack of studies on the economic effects of environmental innovation at the macroeconomic level. In particular, with respect to the role of demand and consumer preferences, the distinctive effect of environmental product and process innovation, and the compensation and substitution effect between more and less polluting products. Why the gap in the literature? This is mainly due to a lack of data on the economic effects of this type of innovation, both at the national and international level. Therefore, the following chapter draws on different strands of literature and calibration and simulation techniques to undertake this investigation. Chapter 3 introduces a structurally computable general equilibrium model to address these limitations. The general equilibrium framework represents all the direct and indirect effects of innovation on consumption, investment, output, and employment. In addition, the function enclosures from the structuralist literature reproduce the distinctive features of these economies, like underutilization of resources or markup pricing, which allow to overcome the restrictive assumption of standard CGE. Consumer preferences are also modeled through utility functions, where households and governments can choose between different products, therefore incorporating substitution effects. And finally, the model attributes a central role to demand. Here we see a brief illustration of the main causal relationship between the main variables. So we see that our output is driven by consumption and investment. So the principle, Canadian principle of effective demand. On the one hand, we have consumption, which depends on labor and capital income, but also their respective propensity to consume. On the other hand, we have investment. The main drivers are the rate of profits and the rate of capacity utilization. But we also know that consumption in turn depends on labor and prices, which are both function of our output. We know that the rate of profit and the rate of capacity utilization are also directly or indirectly a function of output. So this is a set of simultaneous equations. Here we can also identify the main drivers. On the supply side, the capital accumulation function. On the demand side, we have the endogenous markup function, which relate changes in demand to changes in prices, but also drives the convergence to intertemporal equilibrium. In chapter 4, the theoretical model is calibrated on the Italian economy using a new method, which aims at overcoming the limitations identified in the literature. The main scenarios simulated up until 2050 are an increase in productivity and a change in consumer preferences in favor of the less polluting sector. The base simulation indicates a relative stability in sector patterns. The alternative scenarios suggest that the effects of an increase in productivities are contained in a context of low growth and slowdown in demand. However, a change in consumer preferences may have more important effect on demand, employment, and capital accumulation. Therefore, a policy to raise awareness on the effects of climate change may be more effective in this context. In chapter 5, we introduce the role of international trade using a multi-regional and multi-sector version of the model, including 76 green industries and 100 brown industries. The alternative scenarios simulated are an environmental product innovation and environmental process innovation. So here we also model explicitly qualitative improvement through a parameter in our consumption function. Again, we confirm the relative stability in the regional and sector patterns. However, in this chapter also identifies different effects across sectors. So depending on the patterns prevailing in each sector, the greatest benefits from innovation are concentrated in few industries like machineries and equipment, recycling, financial, transport, and communication. The balance between environmental and socioeconomic effects varies substantially across sectors depending on the prevailing compensation and substitution effects. For instance, an environmental product innovation is best suited in the agriculture, wood, and publishing sector, where an increase in productivity may decrease employment. On the other hand, an environmental process innovation may be more effective in public administration, education, and health sectors, where indirect demand effects prevail. Chapter 6 also draws some main conclusions. First of all, the more and less polluting sectors may be fundamentally different in their structural characteristics, including the role of demand and profitability, but also the initial endowment and markup, and their ability to expand demand. In the context of a closed and stagnant economy, a change in consumer preferences may have more important effect than an increase in productivity. And finally, an effective industrial policy must consider which sector benefits most from the innovation, which type of innovation are more effective in each sector, depending on the compensation and substitution effect prevailing and how they influence the final outcome. Chapter 6 also highlights the main advantages of the structural CGE models. They can analyze the complex simultaneous interaction between the main variables in the economy, but also account for price variation and income distribution effects. They represent interdependencies between the main actors and sectors within the economy. Therefore, they can be calibrated also on input-output tables. They include direct and indirect effects of different types of innovation, but also empirically relevant features like fragmented and oligopolistic market structures, but also on the utilization of resources. And finally, they attribute a central role to demand and preferences. What is the social relevance of this research? To the best of my knowledge, this is the first attempt to investigate this direct and indirect effect of different types of environmental innovation on growth and employment, also in the context of international trade. It provides support for green industrial policies and campaigns to increase the awareness on the effects of climate change. It also illuminates on the complexity and variety of the effects of environmental innovation, which depend on the specific regional and sectoral context. And finally, suggests that the proper balance between environmental and socioeconomic goals can only be achieved through a better understanding of these effects. Who are the main beneficiaries? Consumers. They have a crucial role in fostering demands for green products and therefore influencing production patterns. Governments at the local and national level can calibrate their policy at the specific regional and sector level, but also foster demand through green public procurement. Firms can introduce more product and qualitative improvement to support also growth and employment in their region. And finally, this is also an appeal to statistical offices, institutions, and researchers to further research and collect data on the economic effects of environmental innovation. Thank you very much for your attention. And now stop sharing my presentation and give the floor back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Foster McGregor, who is a professor in innovation and globalization at Maastricht University, and particularly at UNU Merit, and who also was the chair of the assessment committee. I give the floor to Professor Foster McGregor.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, dear Francesca, I should begin by congratulating you on your thesis. I really enjoyed reading it, and obviously it's a thesis that's very relevant at the moment, especially with we have COP going on in Egypt, and I think there are increasing concerns about our ability to solve the problem of climate change, and I think many people believe that this opportunity to limit temperature rises to 1.5 degrees has already passed. So I think it's a very timely and useful thesis. I also found reading it, the thesis is very ambitious. It looks to link together this issue of climate change with socioeconomic challenges around growth, competitiveness, employment, one of the contexts of Southern Europe. And it uses a novel modeling exercise based around structural CG models to try and understand these interactions. Now, the results you just presented now are very interesting, and I think they provide a lot of input for policy discussion. So again, congratulations, and it's good to see you here today defending your thesis. But I have to ask you a question. And I want to start with actually a very general question that essentially covers the entirety of your thesis, particularly the main hypothesis and the approach that you would adopt to address that hypothesis. And I want to sort of push a little bit to see how you feel your thesis fits within the broader literature and within the sort of ongoing policy debate. And your thesis is interested in how structural change can achieve the twin goals of solving or easing the climate change challenge and solving challenges of low growth and high unemployment in Southern Europe. And then you raise this question of whether environmental innovation can be the solution to these twin challenges. And I think that sort of main hypothesis links very nicely with your proposition 2, which I just read. And it reports a quote from Ban Ki-moon, former Secretary General of the UN, and states that saving our planet, lifting people out of poverty, advancing economic growth, these are one and the same fight. We must connect the dots between climate change, water scarcity, energy shortages, global health, food security, and women's empowerment. Solutions to one problem must be solutions for all. And reading that, I think of a similar, or not dissimilar, a different quote I have in my course on socioeconomic development. So when I talk about sustainable development, I include a quote from somebody else, an economist, Kenneth Boulding, who wrote that anyone who believes exponential growth can go on forever in a finite world is either a madman or an economist. So I think they're very different quotes. And it sort of leads me to my question. Why is your focus on finding a solution to the twin challenges of climate growth and weak economic performance the appropriate one? And I'm thinking about this in the context of other sort of discussions around degrowth, around a new world of work, around a push for the increased focus on issues of equality. And to what extent can these be a sort of alternative ways of thinking about the challenge of climate change?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your kind comments and question. Actually, a very interesting and profound question, which would require more than the entire defense to properly address. Of course, yes, I'm aware that there's ample literature that tries to address the issue of sustainability from a different perspective. So we have the old degrowth literature, for instance, which may seem quite in opposition with the approach that I've taken in my dissertation. You may also question the word sustainability itself, of course, like I'm still discussing the possibility of decoupling growth and therefore reducing emission while still keep growing. And also it's not immediately obvious these sustainability aspects. So this seems to take like a more standard approach if you want. However, I must say that well, first of all, the overall approach of this thesis starts from my main interest, that is environmental innovation. So it was mainly driven by an ambition that you said is evident already in the dissertation, that was to, before I've been studying the effects of environmental innovation at the industry level, and I wanted to expand this investigation at the macroeconomic level. So this starts from my specific and major interest for the effects of environmental innovation, as I could not find in the literature and in all the reports that I read by the European Union, rich literature on the effects of eco-innovation at the firm level, at the project level, sometimes at the industry level, but there was almost nothing that would allow us to draw any kind of conclusion about the effects of this environmental innovation at the macroeconomic level. So probably this old dissertation did not start as an idea of how to find the best solution for the sustainability challenge, but probably it was a tentative to investigate something that I found was a main gap in the literature. And the main gap that I also highlighted with respect to the effect of environmental product innovation, because we know that there is a huge literature, like the management literature, there is an abundance there with respect to investigating the effect of product, of quality changes. Unfortunately, there seems to be not so much interdisciplinarity. So in the economic literature, there seems to be no mention of this qualitative improvement. We have, of course, a few theoretical models, even in the standard literature, like Genenowit and Asimoglu, but we have not much with respect to the empirical investigation of this differentiated effect of environmental product and process innovation. Also, with respect to the literature that you mentioned, I don't find that my dissertation actually the conclusion of my dissertation excludes another stream of literature. So they are not necessarily in contrast, although it may appear to be the case. And this is because although I'm not prospecting degrowth, I do account for different ways of growing in our economies. And for instance, one of the main extensions that I'm hopefully dealing with in the near future of my model is also to incorporate a circular framework in these type of models. So the idea is that the effects of environmental innovation, so investigating environmental innovation is here crucial. Also, if we want to, for instance, guarantee a circular economy, because if we think about it, if we need to account for our waste and to transform what is currently our waste and to use the output and to transform it in further inputs for our economy, we can keep growing. We can just keep growing in a more circular way instead of simply a linear way. So what I'm trying to say is that my research does not deny the necessity, first of all, to reduce emission at the firm level in every sector, more and less polluting sector, but there is already some research existing on that, right? So we have most of the models that are currently existing incorporate productivity. Some models incorporate green vintage capital, models incorporate also green capital. There is some literature also investigating these type of effects. And there is, as you mentioned, an important literature on the growth, and also many studies on circular economy, hopefully many more in the years to come. What I found actually is that the topic that I decided to address in my dissertation was a bit neglected, if you want. So this is by no means a way to underestimate the importance of other streams of literature. The idea is that we all have to contribute toward that solution of this challenge. There's no one solution. Environmental innovation cannot be absolutely the only solution to the climate and economic challenge. It can contribute, and I believe that is also very important also for other streams of literature, circular economy literature. We need also innovation to guarantee these circular frameworks. We need to recycle our resources. We need more innovation in this respect. So probably I see that there are a variety of efforts, hopefully, that are all going in one direction, that is to save the planet, but also guarantee the basic income and labor for our population in the short term. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The University of Groningen, and who was also a member of the assessment committee. The floor goes to Professor Los.
Thank you very much, Mr. Prorector. Dear candidates, I would also like to congratulate you with your thesis. It deals with very important issues, and it also contains novelties of various types. And I especially appreciate the data work that was also involved in coming up with this nice book. So I read it with a lot of interest. My question mainly deals with chapter 4 of your thesis. So in that chapter, you model a closed economy, and then the model that you developed there is expanded into a global model in chapter 5. So my question also bears some relevance to chapter 5, I think. So in this chapter 4, you calibrate the theoretical model of chapter 3. And in order to keep the model tractable, you argue, I think correctly, that you have to reduce the number of industries. Otherwise, the analytical part becomes too complicated. So what you do is that you split industries into two categories: the environmental creditors and the environmental debtors. And you do so based on how much an industry emits in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and how much value added it produces. And then in the next stage, you focus on shifts in consumption and investment patterns. So in a sense, you focus on the behavior of final users, for example, if relative prices change. Now, final users buy products, and these products can be seen as bundles of contributions by industries. So for example, if I would buy a new laptop, then I would buy a product that is produced by activities in the mining industry, by activities in the steel industry, in the metal products industry, in financial services, and of course also in the electrical and optical equipment industry. So I think there is, in a sense, a disconnect here between the products that are actually bought by the final users and the industries that emit and create value added. So given that you have the data, the input-output tables, I wonder what are the main reasons for not having considered the emission footprints of final product. So the emissions and the value added associated with producing a final product in all stages of production, also in upstream activities. So I hope you can tell me a little bit about why you made this decision. Thank you very much.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your comments and question. Yes, indeed, in chapter 4, I calibrate the model that I presented and I just presented here on the Italian economy. And as you suggest, there was a division in these two sectors that actually, of course, chapter 5 introduces also a multi-sector version of this model. Let me first take a step back and clarify the division of between these two sectors. So the main reason for this division, while in chapter 5, I had to re-aggregate the number of sectors. So I had these 35 sectors that then I aggregated in 20 sectors. And that was mainly to improve the tractability of the model. So the model had quite a lot of non-linear equations, and therefore it was a bit more difficult to find real solutions. So that was obviously the tractability was a main issue there. But in chapter 4, the division between environmental creditors and debtor actually does not respond to mainly tractability problem, but it was done mostly to highlight the difference between these more and less polluting sectors. So the idea to aggregate in these industries that may seem counterintuitive, especially like if you refer to, for instance, input-output analysis, right? In this case, the idea of dividing these industries in two main macro sectors was to highlight what are the differences in the structural characteristics, but also to highlight what are the main trends for more and less polluting industries over time. And of course, most importantly, to analyze these structural changes and redistributive effects from more to less polluting sectors. So the second part of your questions was referring actually to the fact that products are, and I absolutely agree with you. We take also systemic perspective on innovation and the products. Are in fact a contribution of the different industries within the supply chain. And that was actually discussed more in detail in chapter 5. In this chapter, actually, I started from the idea of how to best divide the economy into sectors. And there I had, to be honest with you, not much literature as a reference point and many doubts on how to proceed to correctly divide these more or less polluting sectors. So there were several phase of test and trial on which indicator would better fit this division, because most of the indicators that are currently available, they actually refer to, for instance, like if we think about the target goals for the European Union, right, in terms of emissions, they always refer to variation compared to 1990 level. So we usually look at variations in emissions and value added over time. So I think that was the main concern and the starting point for this chapter. And the idea is that this was a problem for me because I needed an indicator that would allow me to disaggregate the economy into main sectors without referring to variation, but to be able to divide my economy at a specific point in time. For instance, in my base year, but also in the following year. In this respect, I needed also an indicator that did not take into account marginal cost of reducing emissions, because I had like less polluting sectors, right, where probably an additional unit of emission reduction would be more expensive compared to more polluting sectors. So I guess the problem of the division of the economy was also indeed very much related to my challenges in coming up with a proper indicator to divide these economies. So what I try to do here is that I instead took a different perspective. So I relied on a certain indicator like emissions to value added ratio, but in this time this time. So in this context, I used contribution to emissions and contribution to value added. In this fourth chapter, yes, I focus mainly on emission produced in my closed economy. And honestly, this indicator usually of emissions to value added is used with respect to emissions produced in the economy. So I kind of was a bit closer to the usual standard use of this indicator environmental contribution to value added contribution. I also had many doubts on this chapter whether to further disaggregate each sector. But at the moment, as I thought, probably I did not have enough data to divide these sectors. I, if you want, decided to take a more conservative approach also in this respect. If you see, the thesis is indeed like a bit of a step-by-step. So I started from this basic set of equation. I tried to develop to a two-sector model. I introduced a bit of change in the fourth chapter, but I didn't know to what extent I could introduce change as I did not have any reference in the standard literature. So yes, I would agree with you that probably I would have incorporated, or I could have incorporated also, as I did in chapter 5, for instance, when I used the matrix decomposition of emissions, I could have still had a closed economy, even a two-sector economy, given the main purposes of my dissertation. But probably, yes, I could have also added the part on the matrix decomposition of emissions. Well, I decided probably instead to still focus on a more standard indicator and standard use of these emissions to value-added contribution.
Thank you so far. Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Ivanova, who is a senior researcher at Urbanization and Transport at the Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency, and whose area of expertise is regional computable general equilibrium modeling. So that's a mouthful, but she definitely will have a very interesting question. She was also the third member of the assessment committee. The floor goes to Dr. Ivanova.
Thank you very much. Oh, dear candidate, thank you for a very interesting dissertation. And I think that I, out of my own experience, appreciate the technical difficulties that you have probably experienced in building CGE models. And I know how much work it is, and it's not always easy to do. So I have a lot of appreciation for the work that you did, building even multiple models based on the real data sets and also calibrating them on the real time series data, which is very rarely done. And my question is actually about the calibration of the model. So you calibrate the model on the data between the 95 and 2005, and you use as an indicator of a goodness of fit of your parameters with the data and Pearson correlation index. So I was wondering what has driven your choice of this, because if you look at the literature, the people propose other indicators such as the maximum likelihood or cross entropy, Bayesian cross entropy. So I was wondering why did you choose this indicator? And also looking at the time series, it is relatively old at the present moment. So do you think that that if you take the model that has been calibrated on this relatively old data, you try to run it until 2020 or before the corona period, whether you think it will reproduce relatively good the main development of the economy?
Yes, Simo Polen, thank you very much for your kind comments and question. Let me start then from your last point, that is about the time series and the fact that is relatively old. And I would agree with you that it's up until 2005. So certainly we don't have recent data, or even, for instance, we cannot account for the effects of financial crisis or the COVID pandemic. So I would like, first of all, address this point. And the main issue here with respect to data availability. So my type of model is indeed calibrated on word input-output table, and I'm actually very, very grateful to everyone that is working on these tables and is providing us with this detailed data that are absolutely essential for our research. The main idea is that I wanted to use the word input-output database that has many advantages, including the fact that, of course, allow as panel data, so it provides like the possibility to have the time series of these input-output tables compared to maybe other data sets, I don't know, the GTAP, or also as is coherent with trade statistics, so as a number of advantages. And the main idea also, of course, is freely available. That's another important point. So the idea is that I wanted to rely on these data sets. But the problem is that there were at the moment 2 releases, 2013 and 2016. And back then, if I remember correctly, only the 2013 release had the environmental accounts. So, well, I started my PhD a few years ago. So the idea is that back then, that was the latest version of the dataset, including environmental accounts available for my research. And what I found interesting from this dataset is that I already had data for also the socioeconomic accounts, the word input-output table, but also socioeconomic account and environmental account. They were already, everything was already balanced and consistent. So I didn't have to invest additional effort, risking also to make mistakes into rebalancing different data sources. So that was quite useful. I must add in this respect that, of course, as a few people here are aware, and everyone has been working on this database, that's a lot of effort in the construction of the data sets. And of course, they have to rely on statistics that are not immediately available. Then they have to rely on national input-output tables, supply use tables that have to be reconciled. And I've never done this, and I really appreciate these efforts, but of course, it requires quite some time. So I imagine that I will not have the possibility to have immediately available this type of data in like a couple of years. So in this respect, the main concern was indeed like that I wanted to rely on this type of data, but the latest version available was that. But even the version from 2016 would have covered actually only a few years more. Also, with respect to the time frame, actually what I believe is indeed the dissertation takes a different approach compared to the existing models. We know that well, actually, several models that are currently existing use the calibration to a base year, so basically to a single equilibrium observation. So that would have been for me to calibrate the model to 1995 or even 2005. While I decided to undertake, let's say, a lot more work in this respect, because I indeed decided to provide and to aggregate this input-output table, so intermediate final output matrices, all the sub-matrices in the word input-output table for the entire decade. So I believe in this respect, the calibration approach chosen already, because I try to address the main problem, the main criticism in the literature of this single equilibrium observation that may not be representative, right? Because we calibrate to a base year, but then we may have like, there's no indication of performance, so we may have that this base year is used for the next 20, 30 years. While in my case, I'm still using 10 years to then project this over the coming 20 years or 30 years or so. So in this, probably it's already like a further step compared to many existing models. Also, with respect to the estimation, so the first part of your question, the idea was actually to find a measure of performance. I wasn't, again, like I had many doubts on how to proceed in this respect. And what I wanted to do was to address this not for the entire model, but actually to address specifically each equation. My hope was also to be able to use this method in the extended version of the model, while actually reproducing these calibration procedures on each separate sets of equations, which unfortunately, as I mentioned in my dissertation, was not possible. So the idea was first to refer to the literature and to identify a main, to define the main range for the estimation of these parameters. And indeed, since I was trying to address this for each specific equation to increase the precision in the estimation of my parameters, I also tried other estimation methods, but I felt not comfortable using that with just a few observations. So I think that's the main reason why I chose the Pearson correlation test, because since I wanted to really like have a literature review for each of the key parameters, I actually also cut a lot in the final version, but I had an extensive literature review for each equation, for each key parameters of the equation. And then what I had, I tried different estimation methods, which would provide me still, like, for instance, a differential propensity assumption. Other estimation methods would still suggest that there is an important difference in the propensity to consume out of labor and capital income, but still the probabilistic estimation, like to use like something different from a Pearson correlation test with a sample of, like 10 observation for that specific equation would not have made me very comfortable. That's the main decision. I hope I answered the both parts of your question.
Definitely. Thank you so much. The opposition will be continued by Dr. Meyers, who is an associate professor at the Department of Economics at the School of Business and Economics, but is also connected to UNU Merit. And he was the last member of the assessment committee, and the floor goes now to Dr. Meyers.
Thank you. Thank you. Dear candidate, dear Francesca, of course, I first want to concur with the previous member of this committee and their remarks on the interesting thesis and the pleasure reading it. I also want to congratulate you with your perseverance to finalize the work, and also on this work that is challenging the employment and sustainability questions that are very timely today. Of course, especially on this opening day of the climate conference in Egypt. Of course, I do have some questions, and I also would like to focus here on chapter 4 in more detail. So in that chapter, you create a sector model for the Italian economy, and you use this model to simulate two kinds of effects. One is the change in demand of goods, and the other one is in a change in productivity of these sectors. So in your model, you distinguish between 35 sectors, what you already mentioned, and you also assume that if there are consumer changes in consumer preferences, that these consumer preferences changes between those sectors. And but of course, if you look at the literature and the applied literature, then we find some good examples of sustainability of goods which are more within the sectors. So the switch of consumers from more meat to more vegetable-based alternatives, for instance, in the food sector, or to switch from combustion-driven transportation modes to electric cars, etc., etc. So a lot of these substitutions are actually within the sector and not so much between the sector. So that's one element in your model where you focus on. And the second part is also on the comparison between what you do actually in your model is you have a 25% change in the consumer preferences, and you compare that actually with the 25% in change in productivity. If I'm well, have understood your thesis well, of course. And the question is, are these two simulation exercises comparable? And to what extent, if you compare the 25% change in consumer preferences, what are the costs to do so, and what would be the cost to have a 25% change in productivity? So why are these both simulations comparable to each other without having further investigations in the background or in the cost of such changes? And also that in your final chapter, in your last chapter, you conclude that I refer here to your thesis, in the context of a relatively closed and stagnant economy, a change in consumer preferences towards environmentally friendly products can have more important effects than an increase in productivity. And the question is, how can you make such a comparison without actually going back to what would be the cost of such changes? So actually, I have two questions actually. So one question is, how do you see that you can have the sustainability between the sectors, whereas most literature goes on the sustainability within sectors? So how can we see that? And the second question is, how can we then compare, or how can we understand the comparison between a 25% change in the parameters of the sustainability compared to a 25% change in productivity? I'm looking forward to your response.
Simon, and thank you for your kind comments and question. Let me address your first question. With respect to, so you rightfully pointed out that chapter 4 starts with addressing the structural changes within the economy, but focusing on these more or less polluting sectors and then substitution effect across sectors, while actually highlighted that both within industry and substitution effect across industries are both relevant in this respect. And actually, as you rightfully pointed out, the first may be even more important. Once again, I must refer to my previous comments. That is, I decided in the dissertation to take a really step-by-step approach in this respect. So I first started with, so the calibration 4, when I started with chapter 4, when I started with chapter 4, I had many challenges ahead, because it's true that the literature also investigates substitution effect between firms, but I didn't have much reference in the literature with respect to the economic effects of environmental innovation, and specifically to the substitution effects of this type of environmental innovation. In this first chapter, given that I introduce a new calibration procedure and introduce a new indicator that I mentioned, so I think these two issues go a bit hand in hand, because the idea is that I introduced this indicator and I decided to divide the economy in two main sectors. And the idea was mostly to focus in this part of the thesis on the redistribution. So my first question was mostly, what happens if some of the key sectors of the economy, like education or recycling, for instance? So what happens if some of these key sectors of the economy strengthen or increase their market share? Of course, we cannot expect, and I pointed out all the limitations in the use of this indicator, we cannot expect that these sectors will take over the entire economy, and we certainly do not expect that the food sector will disappear, for instance. Also, most of these sectors are complementary, but the idea was really like to focus here on structural changes, because the indicator that I had and I decided to introduce, which is already like a new step compared to what is existing there, was mainly to divide the economy in these two main sectors. So the idea is we have two macro categories, more or less polluting, and then we want to analyze. We have models that are already investigating what happens if each firm reduces, for instance, its level of emissions. What is not existing out there is something that try to understand how a structural change in the economy, how some sectors prevailing over others can actually contribute to the dual economic and environmental challenge. I decided to address this.
May I interrupt you, because I think you're going. I think your response is very well, and it's a pleasure to listen to you. Given the fact that I've got two more opponents, whom I would also like to have an opportunity to challenge you, because it's pretty difficult to challenge you because you've got adequate responses. So I give the floor now, with apologies to Dr. Meyers, to Professor Moonen, who, as we all know, is professor in econometrics of technical change at Maastricht University. The floor goes to Dr. Moonen, Professor Moonen.
Thank you, Professor. Dear candidate, dear Francesca, I would have a question on the last chapter. As you just explained in chapter 4, you allow for environmental innovation, which then generates a substitution of consumption from more to less polluting sectors. In chapter 5, you also then allow for an open economy with a possible substitution in, if I understand correctly, the possible substitution of production in different countries, depending on which countries are less polluting in producing certain goods than other countries. My question is, have you also taken into account the second and the third order effects? What I mean by that is, if, for instance, you decide to switch to another consumption good which is produced, say, in China, China maybe in that particular sector is less polluting than the production in some other countries, but China in some other industry, to produce that good, maybe it has to import itself products from other countries which are very polluting. So the second and third order effects, if you look to think of it in terms of the Leontief inverse, have you taken the Leontief inverse into account? Basically, that is my question.
Thank you.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your comments and question. Yes, in the fifth chapter, indeed, I consider both within industry and across industry substitution effect. So the main idea is that we have a consumption function where the consumer can choose between different type of products. We have different levels, and the levels we are interested in is actually the last one, where the consumer, for instance, for the food sector, can choose between 10 different products coming from 5 different regions, both green and brown. So first I decided how to allocate my budget across the different sectors, and then between the different products within the same sector. So this take into account first order substitution effect between green and brown products from the same region or different regions. Indeed, it does not take into consideration a second or third order effect. However, so we are using a general equilibrium. So I have actually 2 answers to this question. The first is we use a general equilibrium approach. So therefore, all the effects, so my increase or decrease in consumption of products from China, for instance, which would be the rest of the world in our case, would actually affect also that region, and would in turn affect also all the intermediate inputs used in the production of that good. So my interest and the reason why I chose this general equilibrium framework complemented with the structuralist literature was indeed to be able to analyze all the feedback effect throughout the global economy. So in that sense, we are also taking into consideration the fact that when I change my consumption and I switch from my green products to Chinese products, then I would also in turn have variation in all the intermediate inputs required to produce that good. So all the feedback effects are considered in the model. However, I must acknowledge that if you are referring to second, third order effect in terms of environmental emissions, so as you mentioned, the Leontief inverse, so the traditional approach in input-output analysis, that's not what I'm taking here. And the reason is, once again, because I'm using as an indicator this environmental contribution to emissions over contribution to value added. So the idea was actually not to take, so in an input-output analysis, you would have actually potentially an infinite step in accounting for the levels of emissions, right? Because it's like almost infinite matrices there. In my case, I simply use the technical coefficient matrix, so RA. So I not use the identity minus A to the power of -1, but only my A. And the issue is that I also consider the possibility of using like the Leontief inverse, but then my doubt was, how do I compare the contribution to emission across the entire supply chain to the value added produced in that sector? So it didn't make a lot of sense for me. And yeah, maybe I was wrong, but everything was kind of new to me. So I decided to actually try to compare something that for me was more reasonable, that is the emissions in the first stages for the products. So like try to use only the technical coefficient matrix to account for emission demanded over value added produced in that sector, which was for me a more reasonable indicator than emission throughout the supply chain over value added produced at one stage of the production process. Thank you.
Dr. Nomada, the floor goes to you.
Thank you. Well, dear candidates, it was a pleasure to read your thesis indeed. And I think there should be more theses like this in the world. So, but there is one thing, of course, so I couldn't really fully realize the full joy of enjoying your thesis because of one particular thing. That is, I'm not a big fan of these structuralist models. In my taste, these are too Keynesian because they're completely demand-based and there's no supply side to it in the model. So without a supply side, you see what happens. You cannot even define an unemployment rate because the labor supply is not considered and productivity growth is another part of the model. So at the end of the day, what you see that you have open-endedly growing labor, which is completely an unacceptable thing, right? So because labor productivity would compensate that. So therefore, it is not possible to use your models, steady-state properties, to study them. So instead, what you do is you are not looking at steady states. You are only calibrating the entire model on the basis of a medium run perspective, and you are just looking at in terms of the simulations, right? So now I have a philosophical question in this sense. I mean, how do you justify in your mind, that is, using a model which basically the steady-state properties of which you cannot use, but still use exactly the same model for its transient properties under calibration? And of course, related part is that, so you are just saying that, so you have a model which is which reproduces the distinctive features of the South. So I wonder, so if this statement is anything to do with the way you modeled, so if it's about the equations of the model, or is it about the particular calibration exercise you have made? So could you just also capture the distinctive features of the Northern Europe with the same model?
Yes, Simon, thank you very much for your kind questions and comments. I will try to briefly address this very complex question. So with respect to the first part of your question, the demand versus supply side. Well, first of all, I do think that we still take into consideration the supply side. So this model is not a purely Keynesian model. So although it's driven by effective demand, so we follow like this, you're right, Keynesian principle of effective demand, and demand as a central role in the model. This model, I believe, because it combines the characteristic of the general equilibrium models, so that the more standard CG, if you want, with this distinctive feature of the structural literature, could still take into consideration these effects on productivity. For instance, we could have a supply shock, a productivity shock, and that was modeled in the more theoretical model, because then I decided to focus on actually a process innovation there, so for productivity improvement, but potentially we could also take into account. So I see more this model as trying to reconcile the importance of demand with the existence of a supply side. However, you're right that demand has a central role in the model, and that was done on purpose because my main focus were the Southern European economies. So the idea is that these are peculiar economies where the role of aggregate demand is important, because we have fat dependency, hysteresis, we have decades of slowdown in growth, and therefore I made very clear in the assumption of the model what is my intake of the existing reports, including Istat's reports on the current status of the Italian economy. And I do believe that the main problem there is actually the decline in aggregate demand, rather than a problem on the supply side. We do have also problem on the supply side. I will not start on that because it's a very long list, from material and immaterial infrastructure, but let's say that I think our main concern at the moment, we have a slowdown in growth, internal demand, and demand in general. With respect to the point on labor, yes, it's true that we assume that there is like an almost infinite pool of labor available. This could be easily resolved, in my opinion, with still keeping the core of the model while introducing a supply function for labor. But this, of course, is a bit in contradiction with the Asymacopoulos interpretation of it.
You may briefly conclude your response. Please.
Thank you very much. So to conclude, we do also include a steady state, and in a calibrated version of the model, we have indeed a steady state, although that's explicitly, that was my decision, not the main focus of the model. And indeed, with respect to the distinctive features of the Southern European economy, the model is purposely built to reproduce the distinctive features of this economy. However, it could be also calibrated on different kind of economies and on different regions, because indeed the value of the parameters, like for instance, the markup, could be much lower and even very close to zero in the case of an economy like the US. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Francesca Rubiconto, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed, and the degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. I request that you and your company watching await the results of our deliberations and our return in this internet room. again. Francesca Rubiconto, the degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And in view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Verspaget and Professor Fontana are authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I invite your supervisors to now take the floor. And the floor goes to both Professor Verspaget and Professor Fontana.
You go first, Roberto.
Okay. Do you promise to work in accordance with the principle of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Francesca Rubiconto, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university.
The beadle will show you the degree.
No, dear Francesca, a PhD trajectory is always completely integrated with the candidate's personal life. And for some people, that's a very smooth process, but unfortunately for others, it's not. And in your case, I feel that it has not been a very smooth ride. As you have in the opening paragraph of your acknowledgements, you consider this to be the most difficult, but also the most meaningful journey that you've taken in your life. And having been a small part of that journey, I can totally see why you have chosen those words. Now, unfortunately, as supervisors, sometimes we make this process a little more difficult. And I'm fully aware of the fact that I, as one of the supervisors, have also done that by insisting on all kinds of things that you change or take into account or do this or do that. And I realize that that has contributed certainly also to some of the not so smooth processes. But I'm very glad that you persevered because I think in the end, this has resulted in a thesis which is indeed a very good and interesting thesis. And I hope that some of these things that we insisted on as supervisors have contributed to that. Now, in our field of innovation studies, as you rightfully call it, also in those acknowledgements, there's often very little attention to the sort of macroeconomic issues that you have addressed in this thesis. A lot of people look at micro things, sectoral things, that's all very fashionable. And I, in fact, have had the privilege of supervising quite a few theses across the years, but only a handful of them deal with the macroeconomic topics like your thesis does. And I'm very happy that that you have chosen that particular topic because I think it's a deserving topic, it's an interesting topic, and it's an important topic. You've done that in a technically sophisticated way, computable way. You've done applied work, which is all very original and relevant. The methods that you've chosen are relevant methods. And of course, the thesis addresses the main global problem that we have now discussed over the past hour, and which we need to discuss even more to be able to come to some possible directions of solutions. And I think in the end, despite the fact that it has been such a difficult journey, you can be very proud of this piece of work, and I certainly am, to have that thesis here today on my desk. I also hope that this moment in time, when you've successfully defended your thesis, is the start, or at least a delineation of a new stage in your life that will be a little bit less difficult, both personally, but which will also bring you academic success, which you can now, really try to find, given that you have the degree that you need to really kick off that career. Now, in the acknowledgements, you also show, and in the end, you also realize that you have people around you who can support you in that process. You have many friends that you thank. You have family that you can rely on to make that next stage of your life, of your career happen. And I hope that you will be able to do that and that you will find the success that you definitely deserve. I will certainly put that thesis at a very prominent place on my bookshelf, along with the other handful of theses on these macroeconomic topics, the writers of which are here in many different forums in this session. And that's certainly a special place for me on my bookshelf. And I'm very proud and happy that your thesis is now a part of that group. So, Francesca, thank you very much for having worked with us, for your patience, and congratulations on this big achievement. You deserve it, and you did it very well in the end. So enjoy it. Thank you.
Dear Dr. Rubiconto, also on behalf of Maastricht University, I congratulate you, your family and friends, but also your supervisors with the degree which you have acquired. I would like to thank the members of the degree committee for their contribution today. Thank you very much. And with this, I'm closing this session.